In December 1944, as snow fell silently over the Ardennes forest, the Western Front seemed almost quiet. Many American units believed the worst of the war in Europe was already behind them. After the liberation of France, the German army appeared weakened, retreating, and increasingly desperate. But deep inside Nazi headquarters, Adolf Hitler was preparing one final, high-stakes gamble, an operation so bold that even some of his own generals doubted it could succeed. The plan was simple in concept, but enormous in scale. Strike through the Ardennes, a region the Allies considered difficult terrain for a major offensive. Split the British and American forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, it could fracture the Allied alliance and force a negotiated peace. It was a plan built not on Germany's strength, but on speed, surprise, and the hope that the enemy would be caught completely off guard. To execute this operation, Hitler assembled some of his last powerful armored forces, including the feared 6th SS Panzer Army under the command of Sepp Dietrich. These were not inexperienced troops, they were veterans, hardened by years of brutal combat on multiple fronts. They carried with them the reputation of blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had once shattered entire nations in a matter of weeks. In the early hours of December 16th, under the cover of darkness and heavy fog, the offensive began. Artillery thundered across the frozen landscape, followed by waves of German infantry and tanks pushing through the thinly held American lines. Communication lines were cut, units were isolated, confusion spread rapidly among the defenders. For many American soldiers, it felt like the war had suddenly reversed itself. The Germans advanced quickly, far faster than the Allies had anticipated. Within days, they had driven a deep bulge into the Allied front lines, advancing nearly 60 kilometers. Entire American divisions were forced back, some overwhelmed by the sheer force of the attack. In certain sectors, inexperienced troops faced elite SS units for the first time, and the results were devastating. German commanders believed they had achieved total surprise. Reports from the front suggested that American resistance was collapsing in key areas. Confidence grew among German officers, and with it came a dangerous sense of superiority. There were even mocking remarks, claims that Americans were better suited for trade than for war. After all, the Wehrmacht and SS had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, enduring some of the harshest combat conditions imaginable. Compared to that, they believed, the Americans would not hold. But beneath the surface of chaos, something else was happening. While some American units were retreating, others were beginning to regroup. Small pockets of resistance formed in villages, crossroads, and forest clearings. Soldiers who had been separated from their units began to organize defensive positions. Officers made quick decisions under pressure, often without clear orders, buying precious time. The terrain itself, which the Germans hoped to exploit, also created unexpected challenges. Narrow roads became clogged with vehicles. Fuel shortages began to slow the advance. The weather, while grounding Allied aircraft, also made movement difficult for German armor. Every delay, every bottleneck began to chip away at the momentum that was essential for the success of the offensive. At the center of the German plan was speed. They needed to reach their objectives before the Allies could react. But war rarely follows a script. As the days passed, resistance stiffened. American engineers blew bridges. Supply lines stretched thinner. The initial shock of the attack began to fade, replaced by determination. Far from the front lines, Allied commanders were scrambling to understand the scale of what was happening. Reports were fragmented, sometimes contradictory. Was this a local counterattack or something much larger? As the picture became clearer, the realization set in. This was Germany's last major offensive in the West, and it had to be stopped. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, began to emerge as a focal point.
Whoever controlled it would control the movement of forces in the region. German units moved to encircle it, while American forces rushed to reinforce it. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire campaign. Meanwhile, the German advance, though impressive, was already showing signs of strain. The deeper they pushed, the more vulnerable their flanks became. Supply lines struggled to keep up. Fuel, the lifeblood of any armored force, was running dangerously low. And despite early successes, the Allies were not collapsing. They were adapting. What had begun as a lightning strike was turning into a race against time. And time, more than anything else, is something Germany no longer had.
As the German offensive carved deep into the Ardennes, one location quickly became the focal point of the entire battlefield: Bastogne. It was not a large city, nor heavily fortified, but its importance lay in something far more critical: roads. 7 major roads converged there, making it a vital hub for movement, supply, and coordination. Whoever controlled Bastogne could control the flow of the battle. German commanders understood this immediately. As their armored columns pushed westward, orders were clear: take Bastogne and take it fast. Speed remained everything. But as they approached, they encountered something unexpected: resistance that refused to break. American forces, though scattered and under pressure, were already moving to reinforce the town. Among them was the 101st Airborne Division, a unit trained for rapid deployment and aggressive defense. They arrived not as part of a carefully planned operation, but as an emergency response, rushed in by trucks, often without full equipment, and thrown directly into defensive positions. They were joined by elements of other units: engineers, artillery crews, and stragglers from shattered divisions. What formed in Bastogne was not a perfect defensive force, but a determined one. Soldiers dug foxholes into the frozen ground, set up roadblocks, and prepared for what they knew was coming. The weather turned brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow covered the ground, and thick fog limited visibility. Supplies were scarce from the beginning. Many troops lacked proper winter clothing. Ammunition had to be carefully rationed. Medical supplies were limited, and evacuation of the wounded was nearly impossible. Yet despite these conditions, the defenders held their positions. Soon, German forces completed the encirclement. Bastogne was cut off. No reinforcements could reach the town. No supplies could get through. The men inside were surrounded by elements of multiple German divisions, including experienced armored and infantry units. Artillery fire rained down day and night. Probing attacks tested the American lines from every direction. At the center of the defense was Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. Calm under pressure, he coordinated the defense with limited information and even fewer resources. Communication was difficult, often reduced to runners moving through dangerous conditions to deliver orders. German commanders, confident in their position, believed the situation was already decided. From their perspective, Bastogne was isolated, outnumbered, and undersupplied. It was only a matter of time before the Americans would be forced to surrender. On December 22nd, German envoys approached under a flag of truce. They delivered a formal demand for surrender, warning of complete destruction if the Americans refused. The message was clear: there was no escape, no hope of relief, and no reason to continue resisting. Inside Bastogne, the response was almost unbelievable in its simplicity: nuts. It was a single word delivered as the official reply. To the Germans, it required clarification. To the Americans, it meant everything: defiance, refusal, and a commitment to hold at all costs. And holding was exactly what they did. The fighting intensified. German forces launched coordinated attacks, supported by tanks and artillery, attempting to break through the perimeter. Each assault was met with fierce resistance. American paratroopers, often outgunned and outnumbered, used every advantage they could find: terrain,
improvisation, and sheer determination. Artillery units played a crucial role, firing on advancing German formations, sometimes at dangerously close range. Infantry units held key intersections and defensive lines, knowing that a single breakthrough could unravel the entire defense. Engineers laid mines and created obstacles, slowing the enemy advance. But the situation inside Bastogne grew desperate with each passing day. Food supplies dwindled, ammunition stocks ran low, the wounded filled makeshift aid stations where medics worked tirelessly under freezing conditions. Without air support, there was no way to resupply or evacuate. And above all, the weather remained the greatest enemy. Thick cloud cover kept Allied aircraft grounded, denying the defenders the support they desperately needed. For the Germans, it was an advantage, but one that would not last forever. Despite everything, the line held. What made Bastogne remarkable was not just the scale of the attack, but the resilience of those defending it. These were not ideal conditions. This was not a planned stand. It was a fight for survival, carried out by soldiers who refused to give in, even when surrounded. Outside the encirclement, Allied command was already working on a response. Plans were forming, movements were being prepared. But for the men inside Bastogne, none of that was visible. All they knew was that they were alone and that the enemy was closing in. Every hour mattered. Every position held bought time. And somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, that time was about to change everything.
Far from the frozen streets of Bastogne, in command posts layered with maps and radios, George S. Patton was receiving news that would change the course of the war. Reports of the German advance in the Ardennes were coming in fragmented, some exaggerated, some incomplete, but the pattern was clear. A massive offensive was underway, threatening to split the Allied forces and capture key positions. Patton's mind raced. He understood the stakes immediately. Time was not on their side. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone after a call from Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower's voice was calm but urgent. Relief had to come to Bastogne, and the enemy needed to be pushed back before the situation became irreversible. Patton listened, formulated a plan, and stunned everyone around him with his next words: 48 hours, and I attack. It seemed impossible. Moving an entire army through winter roads clogged with snow, ice, and abandoned vehicles would challenge even the most disciplined forces. But Patton had confidence in his troops, in his staff, and in his ability to maneuver under pressure. Orders were issued immediately. The Third Army, numbering over 130,000 men, had to pivot 90 degrees, turn east, and race toward Bastogne through some of the most treacherous terrain in Europe. Logistics became a Herculean task. Fuel had to be redistributed, trucks and tanks needed maintenance under freezing conditions. Supply lines had to be cleared and coordinated while avoiding exposure to German reconnaissance. Engineers worked night and day to ensure roads were passable, even in conditions where snow and ice threatened to immobilize entire columns. The men understood the danger, but they also understood the mission. The lives of comrades depended on it. The march itself was grueling. Temperatures dropped well below zero, and icy roads made every mile a challenge. Tanks skidded, trucks became stuck, and soldiers marched through snowdrifts taller than themselves. Yet morale remained high. Stories of Bastogne's defenders and the need to relieve them spurred every unit forward. The sense of urgency electrified the army, and the troops moved with a determination bordering on obsession. Patton himself was a constant presence. He inspected units, adjusted plans, and refused to allow any delays. His leadership style was unorthodox, sometimes blunt, often intimidating, but it inspired his officers to push harder. Every decision had to be made in real time: which roads to prioritize, how to coordinate infantry with armor, how to allocate scarce artillery resources. It was a massive, dynamic puzzle that had to be solved while on the move. Patton even took personal risks, riding at the front of columns to assess conditions and motivate his men, showing the confidence and fearlessness that had earned him a legendary reputation.
Meanwhile, German forces were unaware of the scale of the response. They assumed that Bastogne's defenders were isolated and that any reinforcements would take much longer to arrive. Their focus remained on the siege, not realizing that one of the fastest-moving armies in history was already pivoting to meet them. Patton's audacity had created an element of surprise that even the Germans could not anticipate. Communication lines were tested to the limit. Field radios crackled with static, messengers navigated dangerous roads, and headquarters worked around the clock to synchronize movements. Coordination across hundreds of miles of frozen countryside was unprecedented, yet somehow the Third Army managed to keep pace. Convoys rolled relentlessly night and day, each mile bringing them closer to Bastogne. By the second day, the first forward elements began to make contact with elements of the 101st Airborne, who had held their positions against repeated German assaults. The morale boost was immediate. Soldiers who had been isolated, cold, and low on supplies now saw hope on the horizon. Relief was coming, led by one of the daring maneuvers of the war. Patton's pivot was not just a military maneuver, it was a psychological strike. The Germans had assumed total control of the situation. Now they faced the terrifying possibility that their siege could be broken, that their momentum could be halted, and that the very army they had thought pinned and defeated was racing to crush them. The shock value alone began to weigh on German command decisions. Every hour of the march mattered. Snowstorms, icy roads, and mechanical failures slowed progress, but the Third Army adapted. Infantry marched beside tanks, engineers cleared obstacles, and artillery units advanced to provide immediate support. It was a coordinated ballet of movement, executed under extreme pressure, yet conducted with precision. By the end of the third day, the Third Army was within striking distance of Bastogne. Patton's gamble, audacious and risky, had paid off. A counterstrike was no longer just a plan, it was inevitable. The men who had endured freezing nights, icy roads, and relentless marching now faced the ultimate test, breaking the German siege and altering the course of the Ardennes offensive forever. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and decisive confrontations of the war. The German army, once confident, would soon find that the Americans they had mocked as merchants, not soldiers, were capable of feats no one had believed possible. And at the center of it all was Patton, moving faster than anyone thought imaginable, turning a desperate situation into a historic victory in the making. The audacity, speed, and precision of this maneuver would later become a textbook example of operational brilliance, studied by military leaders for generations to come.
The morning of December 24th brought a fragile clarity to the Ardennes. After days of relentless marching, the forward elements of Third Army were finally approaching the besieged town of Bastogne. Snow still blanketed the roads, and icy winds cut through coats and uniforms, but the determination in the soldiers' faces was unmistakable. They had endured nearly continuous movement through impossible conditions, and now the moment to strike was at hand. German forces were dug in around Bastogne, confident that their encirclement was complete. Tanks, infantry, and artillery were strategically positioned to repel any attempt at relief. They had underestimated the speed and audacity of Patton's maneuver. Communication lines, stretched thin by the extended march, struggled to relay the sudden change in Allied movements. Commanders in the field were caught off guard, facing a threat they had not anticipated. Every radio crackle, every courier arriving from the front was met with tense scrutiny as both sides tried to anticipate the next move in this deadly game. The first American units made contact with the defenders inside the town. Emotions ran high. Paratroopers who had endured cold, hunger, and isolation saw relief finally arriving in the form of armored columns and infantry. Engineers quickly worked to establish secure routes for supplies and reinforcements to reach Bastogne. Every soldier understood the stakes. The siege had lasted more than a week, and failure to relieve Bastogne would have given the Germans a decisive advantage in the Ardennes. The clash that followed was immediate and intense.
American tanks and mechanized units pushed toward German positions, meeting with heavy resistance. Artillery fire shattered trees and buildings as both sides fought for every inch of road and every intersection. The defenders inside Bastogne joined in, targeting enemy positions with whatever firepower they could bring to bear. Coordination between the advancing Third Army and the entrenched 101st Airborne became a lifeline, combining experienced armored assaults with the intimate knowledge of the town's defenders. German forces attempted to respond with counterattacks, often sending tanks down narrow, icy roads where mobility was limited. Mines, anti-tank obstacles, and well-placed artillery from the Americans slowed every advance. Supply shortages and fatigue were beginning to take their toll on the German troops, who had assumed the siege would end in their favor. The encirclement that once seemed impenetrable was being tested in ways the Germans had not anticipated. Weather continued to play a decisive role. Thick clouds had previously grounded Allied aircraft, but as skies began to clear, fighter bombers and reconnaissance planes arrived, targeting German positions and supply lines. The sudden appearance of air support added to the chaos among German units and bolstered American morale. Soldiers who had been pinned down could now coordinate attacks and direct artillery more effectively, gaining ground with each push. The synergy of air and ground forces amplified every movement, forcing the Germans into reactive positions. Throughout the battle, leadership on both sides shaped every engagement. Patton personally coordinated movements, ensuring that advancing units did not overextend and that reinforcements were sent to critical points. Small unit leaders in Bastogne displayed remarkable ingenuity, organizing counterfire, evacuating wounded, and keeping communication flowing despite broken lines. Every decision mattered, and every moment of hesitation could have changed the outcome. The coordination and resolve of these leaders became a deciding factor in the battle's success. The encircled town became a focal point of brutal urban combat. Streets and intersections turned into choke points. Tanks maneuvered through narrow passages, often under fire from hidden defenders. Infantry advanced in tandem, clearing buildings and coordinating with artillery. German attacks were fierce, but increasingly desperate, relying on shock and brute force rather than coordinated strategy. The momentum they had relied on for the past week was slipping away. By the afternoon, American forces had broken through on multiple fronts. Roadblocks that had once isolated Bastogne were removed. Reinforcements brought food, ammunition, and medical supplies, giving paratroopers and infantry a renewed chance to continue resisting. The encirclement was no longer complete. German forces, stretched thin and facing attacks from multiple directions, began to falter. Their once confident advance was now being pushed back. The psychological impact was profound. German commanders, who mocked American forces as merchants, not soldiers, were forced to confront the reality of an enemy capable of extraordinary resilience and speed. Morale among their troops dropped as supply lines were threatened and losses mounted. The sudden counteroffensive shattered the assumption that the town could be taken without challenge. Civilians in nearby villages also watched anxiously as the fighting raged, witnessing courage and determination under conditions that seemed almost impossible. By evening, the tide had clearly turned. Bastogne was no longer under siege, and the road to pushing the Germans back across the Ardennes was open. Soldiers on both sides understood that the offensive, which had begun with such promise for the Germans, was now faltering. The Third Army's audacious pivot, the skill of small unit leaders, and the courage of the encircled defenders had combined to deliver a dramatic reversal. As night fell, American forces consolidated their gains, prepared to repel any remaining counterattacks, and planned for the next phase of the campaign. Bastogne had held. The town's survival became a symbol of determination, courage, and the unexpected power of audacity combined with precise execution. The battle was far from over, but the breaking of the ring around Bastogne had changed everything, setting the stage for the ultimate collapse of the German Ardennes offensive.
The German offensive in the Ardennes, once a seemingly unstoppable force, began to unravel as the days wore on. The audacity of George F. Patton and the resilience of the soldiers at Bastogne had shifted the momentum. Supplies, already stretched thin for the Germans, were dwindling rapidly. Tanks ran low on fuel, artillery shells were scarce, and the winter weather continued to hamper mobility. The very advantages that had fueled their initial success now became liabilities. The rapid counterattack by the Third Army, moving with unprecedented speed, forced German commanders into reactive decisions that grew increasingly desperate and disorganized. As American forces pressed forward from Bastogne, they encountered German units attempting to regroup and form defensive lines. Many of these units were exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. The speed and coordination of the American counteroffensive prevented the Germans from consolidating, turning what was supposed to be a decisive strike into a chaotic retreat. Villages and crossroads that had fallen early in the offensive were gradually recaptured, often through fierce engagements where soldiers had to fight house by house, street by street. Each recaptured town restored hope to Allied soldiers and civilians alike, signaling that the tide of battle was finally turning. The collapse of the German advance was not immediate, but it was inexorable. Sepp Dietrich's armored units, once symbols of blitzkrieg might, were now reduced to defending isolated pockets against an enemy they had underestimated. Orders became fragmented as communication lines failed under the pressure of constant Allied attacks. German commanders had to witness their forces being pushed back, their carefully laid plans falling apart, and their last reserves being destroyed with each passing day. The psychological blow was severe. Where once there had been confidence and arrogance, there was now panic and disbelief. Soldiers who had once believed victory was inevitable now faced the harsh reality of relentless pressure from an enemy that refused to stop. The broader strategic impact was devastating for Germany. Hitler's gamble, designed to split the Allies and force negotiations, had failed entirely. By January, the Ardennes offensive was over, and the last of the Reich's reserves had been exhausted. The Allies had absorbed the initial shock, stabilized the front, and executed a counteroffensive that restored much of the territory lost during the initial German push. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the German military in previous campaigns was shattered, forever altering perceptions of the Wehrmacht and SS on the battlefield. For the American soldiers, the victory came at tremendous cost, but it was decisive. The courage of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and the audacity of the Third Army's maneuver demonstrated the extraordinary capability of well-led, determined troops under extreme conditions. Patton's leadership, combining speed, decisiveness, and a willingness to take calculated risks, became a defining example of operational brilliance. The ability to pivot an entire army, march through harsh winter terrain, and coordinate a multi-pronged relief operation against a determined enemy would be studied by military leaders for decades. The human dimension of the battle was also profound. Soldiers on both sides endured the bitter cold, hunger, and constant danger. Civilians in the Ardennes witnessed the destruction and the courage of those fighting amidst their towns. The siege of Bastogne, the march of the Third Army, and the eventual breaking of the German offensive became a symbol of determination, resilience, and the unpredictable nature of warfare. Heroism was found not only in strategy, but in the endurance of individual soldiers, often in moments of quiet courage under fire. Every act, from the smallest gesture of support to the boldest counterattack, contributed to a larger story of survival and resistance that would resonate for generations.
By the end of January, the Ardennes campaign had fully concluded. The Germans had been pushed back to their original lines, their offensive shattered, and the myth of blitzkrieg dominance forever altered. Bastogne remained a testament to the effectiveness of combined arms, rapid maneuver, and the importance of morale and leadership. Patton's audacious decisions, the grit of paratroopers and infantry, and the coordination of an army on the move had rewritten the narrative of the battle. It also highlighted the importance of adaptability, communication, and unyielding resolve in modern warfare, lessons that remain vital in military thinking today. The legacy of the Ardennes offensive extended far beyond the battlefield. It demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming odds and seemingly unstoppable enemy advances, determination, leadership, and rapid, decisive action could change the course of history. The Germans had mocked the Americans as merchants, not soldiers, but their assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong. The campaign showed that well-led troops could endure, adapt, and overcome even the most desperate situations. Every maneuver, every march, and every defensive action contributed to a larger narrative that celebrated courage, ingenuity, and the triumph of will over circumstance. For Patton, Bastogne and the Ardennes would become defining moments of his career. The Third Army's maneuver, executed under freezing conditions against a formidable enemy, became legendary. Soldiers who had faced impossible conditions returned home with stories of endurance and heroism, cementing the narrative of American resilience. The failure of the German offensive marked a turning point in the Western Front, hastening the collapse of the Reich and setting the stage for the final Allied advance into Germany. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was not only a test of military skill, but a testament to the courage, ingenuity, and determination that define human conflict at its most extreme. It was a story of audacity, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of victory that would echo throughout history.